The fluorescent lights in the conference room had been flickering for 3 weeks. I'd put in the work order myself. Nobody fixed it. That detail shouldn't matter. But when my son-in-law sat across from me under those stuttering lights and told me my services were no longer required, I kept thinking about that work order. How I'd flagged it. How nobody listened. How some things only get attention after they break completely. I'd been with Meridian Logistics for 19 years. Not the kind of company you've heard of. We didn't have a flashy product or a Silicon Valley address. We moved freight. Medical supplies mostly. Hospital networks across the Ohio Valley, down into Kentucky, up through western Pennsylvania. When a dialysis center in Wheeling needed replacement filters by Tuesday, we made that happen. When a children's hospital in Pittsburgh ran low on IB saline during a February ice storm, my team rerouted 3 trucks through back roads at 2 in the morning. That was the job. Quiet, essential, invisible until it wasn't. I'd built the operations routing system from the ground up, not the software. I'm not a programmer. But the logic inside it, the decision trees, the exception protocols, which carriers to call at 11 p.m. on a Sunday, which regional warehouses kept buffer stock off the books for emergencies, which dispatch managers owed us a favor and which ones needed to be paid in advance. 19 years of that kind of knowledge doesn't live in a database. It lives in a person. My daughter married him 4 years ago. We threw a nice wedding in September at a vineyard outside Columbus. Open bar, good band, the whole thing. I danced with her twice. I thought, walking her down the aisle, that I was gaining a son. What I was actually gaining was a future termination notice. He'd come into the company 18 months after the wedding. The CEO, my boss for 16 of my 19 years, a man I genuinely respected, had started talking about fresh eyes and scaling for the next decade. His son-in-law had an MBA from a school with a good basketball program and 3 years at a consulting firm that had since been acquired and dissolved. On paper, he looked like a modernizer. In person, he was the kind of man who said, "Let's circle back on that," when he didn't understand something, which was often. His title was VP of Operations Transformation. I'm not sure what that meant. I'm not sure he knew either. For the first 6 months, I gave him everything he asked for. Walked him through the routing logic. Explained why we used certain carriers for certain lanes. Showed him the emergency contact binder I kept updated. Actual paper, 3-ring, color-coded by region, and why it mattered even though everything else was digital. He nodded a lot. Took notes on his laptop. Asked questions that sounded smart until you thought about them for 10 seconds. Then he started making changes. The first one was the carrier consolidation. He'd done an analysis, a real one, with slides and everything, showing we could save $340,000 annually by dropping 6 of our regional carriers and consolidating to 3 national providers. The numbers were correct. The analysis was not. Those 6 regional carriers were the ones who answered their phones at midnight. The 3 national providers had SLAs that meant nothing in practice and customer service lines that routed to overseas call centers with 4-hour response windows. I told him this. Politely, professionally, with documentation. He thanked me for my perspective. The regional carriers got dropped in January. The second change was the routing software upgrade. He'd negotiated a contract with a vendor out of Atlanta. New platform, AI-assisted optimization, dynamic rerouting. Genuinely impressive technology. I sat in on the demo and I'll admit parts of it were remarkable, but the implementation timeline was aggressive. The data migration was incomplete, and nobody had bothered to map the exception protocols from the old system to the new one. I flagged this in writing. I sent 3 emails. I requested a meeting. The meeting got rescheduled twice and then canceled. The third change was me. He called it a restructuring. Said the company was moving toward a more data-driven, technology-forward operational model, and that my role, as currently defined, was redundant with the new system's capabilities. He used the word redundant 4 times in 11 minutes. I counted. He did not say I was being fired for being 57 years old. He was too careful for that. But he brought HR in, and the separation agreement had a clause about not pursuing age discrimination claims in exchange for an enhanced severance, 8 weeks instead of the standard 4. The HR manager, a young woman who looks genuinely uncomfortable the entire meeting, slid the paperwork across the table without making eye contact. I looked at the papers. I looked at my son-in-law. He was wearing a tie I'd given him for Christmas 2 years ago. I remembered picking it out. My daughter had said he liked navy blue. I signed the papers, shook his hand, went back to my office, packed a cardboard box, one box, 19 years, and walked out through the loading dock because I didn't want to do the long walk through the open floor plan with everyone watching. My truck was parked in the back lot. I sat in it for a while without starting it. Then I drove to a diner on Route 40 I'd been going to since 1987, ordered coffee and a slice of apple pie, and tried to figure out what came next. I was 3 weeks into figuring that out when my phone started ringing. The first call came on a Tuesday at 6:47 a.m. I didn't recognize the number, but I recognized the area code. It was one of our regional distribution hubs in Steubenville. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from a logistics coordinator I'd worked with for 11 years. A careful, organized man named, well, I'll just call him the coordinator. He sounded like he was trying very hard not to sound panicked and failing. Hey, it's me. Listen, we've got a situation with the new routing system. I tried escalating internally, but I'm getting bounced around. I know you're gone. I know this is a lot to ask, but can you call me back, please? I did not call him back. The second call came 40 minutes later, then a third. By 10 a.m., there were 11 missed calls on my phone. By noon, there were 26. I know the number because I counted them. I did not stop counting at any point. I counted all of them. The calls were from people I'd worked with for years. The overnight dispatch coordinator, the regional warehouse supervisor in Parkersburg, the carrier relations manager in Pittsburgh. At 1:15 p.m., a call came from a number I recognized immediately, the direct line of the CEO himself, the man who'd run the company for 22 years and who had signed off on my termination without ever calling me personally to explain himself. I let that one go to voicemail too. His message was brief. He said there was a significant operational disruption and he'd appreciate it if I could give him a call at my earliest convenience. His voice was steady, but I'd known him long enough to hear what was underneath it. He was scared. I poured another cup of coffee and sat on my back porch and watched the neighbor's dog root around in the yard next door. Here's what I learned later, pieced together from conversations over the following weeks. The new routing system had been running on a parallel track since my departure, and the transition to full operation had happened on the Monday after I left. On Wednesday morning, 2 days later, a hospital network in eastern Ohio flagged a critical delivery failure. A shipment of chemotherapy medications, temperature-controlled, had been rerouted by the system's optimization algorithm to a carrier who didn't have the right refrigeration equipment for that product class. This was exactly the kind of thing the exception protocols were designed to prevent. The exception protocols had not been migrated to the new system. By Thursday, there were 3 separate delivery failures across 2 states. A dialysis center missed a supply window. A surgical center had to reschedule 2 procedures. Nothing catastrophic. Thank God, nothing catastrophic, but serious enough that the hospital network's compliance team was now involved, and when hospital compliance teams get involved, lawyers are never far behind. My son-in-law had spent those 3 days doing what people do when a system they championed starts to fail. He convened meetings, he demanded answers from the vendor, he sent emails with urgent flags, he used the phrase, "This is unacceptable," many times to many people. None of it moved freight. What moved freight, in the old days, was a man who knew which dispatcher in Parkersburg kept a backup carrier list taped to the inside of his desk drawer, who knew that the warehouse in Steubenville had 12 pallets of buffer stock that didn't appear in any system because they'd been purchased off-contract during a shortage in 2019, who knew that a certain carrier in the Wheeling area, a small family operation, would answer the phone at any hour if you called the owner's cell directly, not the company line. That knowledge was in my cardboard box now, sitting in my home office. On Friday afternoon, my daughter called. Not my son-in-law. My daughter. She didn't ask me to fix it. She's smarter than that, and she knows me too well. She just said, "Dad, I don't know everything that happened between you two at work, and I'm not asking you to tell me. But I want you to know I love you, and I'm sorry this has been hard." I told her I loved her too. She said, "Is there anything I can do?" I said, "No, sweetheart, I'm fine." There was a pause. Then she said, quietly, "He's not sleeping." I didn't say anything to that. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I'll talk to you soon." After we hung up, I sat with that for a while. My daughter had nothing to do with the business decision. She'd married a man who turned out to have certain qualities I hadn't fully seen before, and that was hard enough for her without her father adding to the weight. I made a decision in that moment that whatever happened with Meridian, I was going to keep it completely separate from my relationship with her. That decision, as it turned out, became complicated. A friend called me on a Saturday morning about 6 weeks after my termination. He'd been in logistics for 30 years and now did consulting work and expert witness testimony for law firms handling transportation and supply chain disputes. We'd known each other since the early 90s, back when we were both dispatchers working insane hours for companies that no longer exist. He said, "Have you been following what's happening with Meridian?" I said I'd been keeping my distance. He said, "You might want to be less distant." He explained it to me carefully. The delivery failures had triggered a compliance review from the hospital network, and the compliance review had uncovered something that had nothing to do with the routing software. It had to do with billing. Specifically, it had to do with a billing arrangement that had been in place for about 2 years, one that I had not known about and that did not appear in any of the operational systems I had managed. A certain markup structure on temperature-controlled pharmaceutical deliveries that, depending on how a particular federal auditor chose to read it, might constitute a violation of the anti-kickback statute. The anti-kickback statute, for those unfamiliar, is a federal law governing financial relationships in healthcare supply chains. Violating it is not a minor compliance issue. Violating it is the kind of thing that results in federal investigations and, occasionally, federal charges. The billing arrangement had been set up by the CEO, my former boss, the man who'd run the company for 22 years, the man whose daughter my son-in-law had married, the man who was, in the organizational chart that had always seemed so clean and simple, my son-in-law's father-in-law. I sat with that information for a long time. My friend said, "There's a firm representing the hospital network. They're doing depositions. They're going to want to talk to anyone with operational knowledge of the company during the relevant period. That's you, probably more than anyone else." I asked if I was in any trouble. He said, "You had nothing to do with the billing side, you ran operations. But the lawyers are going to want to establish how the company functioned. What was known, what wasn't, how information flowed. You're a key witness." I asked what I should do. He said, "Get your own attorney first. Don't talk to anyone without representation." I got an attorney. A good one, a woman who specialized in employment and commercial litigation and who had a matter-of-fact manner that I found reassuring. She reviewed my separation agreement and noted that the non-disparagement clause covered statements to the media and to competitors, but could not legally prohibit me from cooperating with a federal investigation or providing truthful testimony in legal proceedings. Signed that agreement for 8 extra weeks of severance. Couldn't have gagged me in any way that mattered even if they'd tried. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in February. The law firm's offices were downtown, in one of those glass buildings where the lobby has expensive coffee and uncomfortable furniture. I wore the same suit I'd worn to my daughter's wedding. I don't know why. It seemed right. The attorney representing the hospital network was a methodical man in his 50s who asked precise questions and listened carefully to the answers. We spent 4 hours going through the operational history of the company, how freight moved, how billing was processed, how the temperature-controlled pharmaceutical contracts were structured, who had visibility into what. I answered every question truthfully. I had kept meticulous records throughout my career. Notes, emails, the exception protocols, the work orders, all of it. My attorney had helped me organize it. We brought it all. At one point, the attorney asked me about a specific contract amendment that had been executed about 18 months before my termination. I told him I had no knowledge of that amendment at the time it was executed and had first learned of its existence 6 weeks ago. He nodded, wrote something down, moved on. I don't know exactly what happened after that deposition. Legal proceedings move slowly, and I'm not a party to the case, just a witness. What I know is what my attorney has told me, carefully and in general terms, and what I'd been able to read in the public record. The CEO retired. That's the official language. He retired. The announcement went out in March with language about decades of distinguished service and exciting next chapter. The CEO's son-in-law, my son-in-law, was not mentioned in the announcement because he was no longer at the company either. His departure had come 2 weeks earlier, also officially voluntary, also officially in pursuit of other opportunities. I don't know what those opportunities are. My daughter and I don't talk about him much anymore. She's made some decisions about her own life that I respect and will not discuss here because they're hers, not mine. What I will say is that she called me after his departure was announced. She was calm. She was not okay in the way that people sometimes describe themselves as okay when they don't want to say the alternative. But she was clear-eyed. She said, "I want you to know that whatever happens next, I don't blame you for any of it." I told her that I appreciated that and that she had nothing to apologize for either. She said, "I know, Dad, but I'm saying it anyway." We talked for about an hour, about her plans, about nothing in particular, about a restaurant she'd been to recently that I should try, about whether we were doing anything for Easter. Normal things, the kind of conversation you have when you're finding your way back to each other. The new routing system, from what I hear through people still at the company, was eventually stabilized, a process that took 3 outside consultants and about 4 months. The emergency contact binder I'd maintained for 15 years was, I'm told, found in a storage room and is now back at the dispatcher's desk in Steubenville, where it should have been all along. I did not go back to Meridian. I was asked, not by my son-in-law, who was long gone, but by the new interim operations head, a practical woman brought in from outside who'd spent 20 years running distribution networks for a regional grocery chain. She called me in March and explained the situation and asked if I would consider a consulting arrangement. I told her I appreciated the call and that I needed some time to think. What I thought about, sitting on my back porch with the coffee and the neighbor's dog making noise next door, was what those 19 years had meant. Not the routing system, not the exception protocols. The work, the Tuesday morning when we got those dialysis filters to wheeling through the ice storm. The surgical center in Pittsburgh that didn't have to cancel because someone answered a phone at 2 in the morning. The idea that doing something invisible and essential well, for a long time, matters. I called the interim operations head back the next day. I named a rate for consulting services that was 2.5 times my previous annual salary, prorated to a 6-month contract. She said she'd need to get approval. She called back in 2 hours. Approval granted. I'm 3 months into the consulting arrangement now. I go in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm rebuilding the exception protocols and training 3 people who are going to carry that knowledge forward so it doesn't live in one person again. That was always a fragile way to run things, and I'll acknowledge it. A system shouldn't depend on one person being irreplaceable, but it also shouldn't treat experience like a liability. I think about my son-in-law sometimes, not with anger. That passed faster than I expected, more with something like sadness. He had real intelligence. He could read a spreadsheet and see things in it that others missed. He had good instincts in certain situations. He just had no framework for valuing what he couldn't quantify, and no one in his life, including me, had found the right way to teach him that. Maybe that's partly on me. Maybe I should have tried harder to bridge that gap instead of just flagging the problems and filing the documentation and watching the work order go unfixed. Or maybe some things have to break before people believe they were real. The flickering light in that conference room, by the way, was finally repaired in January. New ballast. 20-minute job. I know because I filed the work order again my 2nd week on the consulting contract. This time, someone fixed it. I keep coming back to that flickering light. Not the routing system, not the federal investigation, not the contract worth 2.5 times what I used to make. The light. The one I filed a work order for 3 weeks before they let me go, and again my 2nd week back, and the 2nd time someone fixed it in 20 minutes. That's the whole story, really. Not the dramatic version, not the depositions or the compliance reviews or the lawyers in the glass building downtown. The real story is simpler than that. Some things only get attention after they break, and some people spend their whole careers making sure nothing breaks and nobody notices, and that invisibility gets mistaken for irrelevance. I don't think my son-in-law was a bad person. I've had months to sit with that, and I still believe it. He was a smart man with real blind spots, and the biggest one was this. He could measure everything that showed up in a report and nothing that didn't. 19 years of 2 a.m. phone calls, of knowing which dispatcher kept a backup list taped inside his desk drawer, of understanding that a relationship with a small family carrier in Wheeling was worth more than any SLA on paper. None of that appeared in any spreadsheet. So to him, it didn't exist. That's not evil. That's a failure of a different kind. A failure of character in the oldest sense. Not dishonesty, but a lack of the patience required to understand what you don't yet know. Real intelligence isn't just processing speed. It's the willingness to sit with complexity, to ask why something has been done a certain way for 15 years before deciding it's obsolete. He never developed that willingness. Nobody had required it of him, and by the time I was in a position to, the organizational chart made it impossible. What I learned, what I keep learning, if I'm honest, is that integrity isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. For 19 years, I answered the phone at 2 a.m. because someone needed dialysis filters, and that was the job. I documented the exception protocols not because anyone asked me to, but because it was the right way to do the work. I signed the separation agreement and walked out through the loading dock and didn't call anyone to tell them what had just happened. Not because I was planning anything, just because that's who I am. And when the lawyers called, I told the truth, all of it, with documentation. That's it. That's the whole formula. Do the work completely. Keep your records. Don't make decisions out of bitterness. When the moment comes where your integrity is either useful or not, you find out whether you actually had it or just thought you did. My daughter and I are finding our way back to each other. Slowly, the way you navigate things that matter. She's clear-eyed and she's going to be fine. That part matters more to me than any consulting contract. The coordinator in Steubenville, the one who left me that first panicked voicemail, stopped by my office last Tuesday to say thank you. He didn't say what for exactly. He didn't have to. I told him to keep the binder updated. He said he would. I believe in.